Evan Thompson, who's another one of the researchers I interviewed for the piece, had a great analogy where he says, if a bird needs wings to fly, but we would never say the flight is in the wing. And a similar analogy might be like, a car needs an engine to drive, but we don't say like the driving happens in the engine. And yet it's with brains, we have this idea that like, well, it requires brains to think or to imagine or to perceive, and therefore those things are happening in the brain. But it's like a weird leap that we don't make with other things. So with the case of the bird, you would say, it's the bird, the whole bird, as well as the air currents. And the air currents are not only like pre-given, but are shaped by the actual movements of the bird, which then affects how the bird moves. So there's this kind of circular feedback, and that whole system is where the flight is. It's not just in the wing. And so the equivalent for that would be like, if you say like, where is experience? It would be in the whole embodied physical system of like an organism interacting with an environment.
What's up, everybody? From Nautilus, I'm Brian Gallagher, and you're watching Behind the Scenes. Today, I'm speaking with Amanda Gefter. Amanda is a science writer and author of the 2014 memoir, Trespassing on Einstein's Lawn: A Father, a Daughter, the Meaning of Nothing, and the Beginning of Everything. She studied history and philosophy of science at the London School of Economics and was a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT. Her writing has been featured in places like New Scientist, Scientific American, Astronomy.com, and the Philadelphia Inquirer. Her recent story in Nautilus was What Plants Are Saying About Us. Your Brain is Not the Root of Cognition. Amanda, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So to start off, could you summarize your intellectual background as well as the sort of stories you found yourself drawn to pursuing in your time as a science writer?
Sure. So my interest started out in fundamental physics and philosophy. So I was always sort of interested in the big questions of, what is nothing? What is something? How did something come from nothing? Which leads right into cosmology and particle physics and quantum gravity and all of that good stuff. So I've mostly written about physics, and then I became super interested in foundations of quantum mechanics, in particular the physicist John Wheeler, who was very interested in questions about observers and what role observers play in reality. And that sort of led me into like an interest in what does it mean to observe? What does it mean to perceive? Cognitive science, all of that. And that sort of is what led me into this story, where, it's challenging certain notions of cognitive science that we typically take for granted.
Exactly. Could you want to give us a brief summary of that story for our viewers who haven't read it yet?
Yeah. So the story it's based on work by a philosopher named Paco Calvo, who is at the Minimal Intelligence Lab at the University of Murcia in Spain, and he works on plant cognition. So it's a really interesting thing because he's a philosopher in the philosophy department, but actually runs a lab where he's like studying plants and doing these really interesting experiments with like time lapse videos of plants behaving and various things. And so his work is really about plant behavior, plant cognition. What are plants capable of? And he has a new book out called Planta Sapiens that goes into all of this. But what I found really interesting is sort of the deeper point about this of, well, is it possible for plants to be cognitive? Is it possible for them to perceive and to be aware of the world? And if so, what does that mean? Like, what does it mean to perceive and to be aware of the world? And so a lot of his critics have come out and said, well, plants might be able to do all these interesting things in kind of, robotic ways. But the idea that they're actually having experiences is like a step too far, because the way that we typically understand experience is that our brains are forming these internal models of the world, and then what we experience is never the world directly, but it's the internal model. And since plants don't have brains, they can't be forming models, and therefore, like, they can't really have consciousness or be aware or experience the world. And what's interesting about that argument is it just takes for granted this particular notion of cognitive science that we forget is just one theory among many. And there are these alternative theories that I talk about in the piece that go by all these different names that start with E, like ecological psychology and enactive, embodied, embedded, extended cognition. And in all of these views, they sort of reject this idea that cognition and awareness and experience are happening internally in the brain, and that it works by using these representations or internal models of the world. And so it basically was like, okay, if plants are doing all these things that we would typically describe as like intelligent cognitive perceptual behavior, and they don't have brains and they're not forming representations, then maybe what Calvo says is like, maybe that means that's not really how cognition works in the first place. And maybe that's telling us something about how our minds work. Maybe our minds aren't forming internal representations. Maybe our brains aren't doing what we think they're doing. And so the story is sort of using this question about what plants can do as a way into a sort of deeper question about what are minds, what are even human minds.
How did you get interested in telling this story and delving into Calvo's ideas? What was the starting point there for reporting this story?
Fascinating. I can't remember the first time I encountered it, but yeah, I saw a talk that he gave somewhere, and he showed some of these time lapse videos of these climbing beans that are trying to like latch onto a pole. And when you speed them up, like if you look at it in real time, you just sort of, it's like a plant that's slowly growing and wandering around. It doesn't look like it's doing anything special. And then when you speed it up, you see that it's like very carefully sort of circling this pole. And then as soon as it senses the pole, it does this thing where it sort of snaps back and then like makes a grab onto the pole. And it just looks like very intentional behavior. And it's sort of wild to watch. And I didn't know that much about plants at all. So I just found that super interesting. But I saw that he had a book coming out. And so I got a copy of the book. And I saw that in the book, he is talking about this view called ecological psychology, which is this understanding of how we can perceive the world without making these internal models. And so I thought like, oh, this is a really cool way to get into this whole question.
What was it like for you hearing him make his case that you don't need a brain to have a mind? How did that strike you? You feel convinced, or?
I am sort of convinced. I mean, so I've been like really interested in these, like, 4E, all these E ideas. And I do find it quite convincing because just from a philosophical perspective, like there's so many issues that plague the standard view. And the brain has sort of become like this incredibly complex rug under which we sweep all of these philosophical problems of like, well, how does the brain create consciousness? And if it's using representations, like who sees the representations? What does it mean for them to see if seeing is just forming more representations? And, there's a whole, history going back to Descartes of these philosophical problems with trying to think of the brain as somehow performing this job of consciousness, or consciousness emerging from, we use the word emergent as if that like tells us anything. So there's been so many questions, and people sort of say, well, like the more we understand the brain, we'll get there. And people have been saying that for so long, and we don't seem to be any closer. And so just based on that alone, I think at least exploring alternative ideas feels necessary. And I do think these ideas are really interesting and don't rely so much on comparing brains to computers, which is like something, we invented, but instead look at like biological systems going all the way back to single cells and plants and this whole evolutionary history of which we are clearly a part. And so it's a much more biologically based approach. And I don't know. So I do find that sort of convincing, but to be honest, I had never thought about it in terms of plants. Like, I definitely thought about it in terms of our minds and in terms of animals, and but to really think about plants being aware of what's going on in some meaning of awareness was pretty radical, and definitely changed how I look at my house plants, which I have many. So
Yeah, I mean, one typical reason you might resist thinking that plants have some sort of mind is you want to be cautious to not over anthropomorphize other things. I mean, this is something that scientists and researchers have expressed caution about, even when researching the minds of other animals. Like, we should be wary of projecting something that humans do onto what these animals do, because there might be some superficial similarity. But in this case, it's kind of, there's some evidence for a kind of anthropomorphization, I guess, if we're trying to establish that they have some sort of sentience akin to ours.
yeah, what's really interesting about this question, so I talked to everyone I interviewed for this article. We ended up having a long conversation about this exact question. And, Louise Barrett, who's one of the scientists that I interview in the piece, she had a great point, which was like, to even say that you're anthropomorphizing something is to already assume that what exclusively belongs to humans, and then to think that you're projecting that, right? So you're making like an assumption from the start, like this is something that's only human, and therefore I'm just making a projection when I say that any other creature is doing this. And that's sort of like begging the question, because here you're trying to say like, well, what can these creatures do? And what do humans have in common with everyone else? And so, and then there's sort of like a double error, because it's saying like, well, we're projecting, these are things that humans do, and we're assuming that only humans do that from the start, and then making that projection. On top of it, we might be really wrong about what we think humans are doing. So to even assume that we understand how our own minds work, where all these capacities come from in ourselves, like that's part of the whole question too. So in a certain sense, it's like, yes, of course, you want to be super careful and not anthropomorphize. And at the same time, you don't want to go so far the other way that you just build in all these assumptions about how humans work and what belongs to humans alone, and then say we can't, link that to other animals, when clearly we come from a long line of evolutionary descent where surely we have things in common with other living systems. And, we like to think we're so special, but maybe we're not so special.
Mm. You write that Calvo likes this quote that goes, "Ask not what's inside your head, but what your head's inside of." What is that supposed to be getting at?
Yeah, it's a great quote. I think it's like William Mace who said that. In all these embodied, inactive, various E approaches to cognition that I talk about in the piece, the sort of fundamental idea, if you summed it up in a slogan, is like the mind is not in the head. And, the mind is really not a noun, not something we have. It's something we do. It's the way that we relate to the world, the way that we sort of adaptively couple ourselves to our surroundings. And in animals, like the brain is clearly helping to enable that to happen. But it's the whole organism that's doing it. So it's the whole organism that's conscious. It's the whole organism that's aware. It's not the brain alone in its like dark sanctuary in the skull that is having experiences. And so this is a very different view than the standard one that we're all used to, which is that like our minds are in our heads. So the quote is really saying like, don't ask what's in your head, ask what your head's inside of, because really like the way that you interact with the world and couple to the world is a big part of what your mind is. Evan Thompson, who's another one of the researchers I interviewed for the piece, had a great analogy where he says, if a bird needs wings to fly, but we would never say the flight is in the wing. And a similar analogy might be like, a car needs an engine to drive, but we don't say like the driving happens in the engine. And yet it's with brains, we have this idea that like, well, it requires brains to think or to imagine or to perceive. And therefore those things are happening in the brain. But it's like a weird leap that we don't make with other things. So with the case of the bird, you would say, it's the bird, the whole bird, as well as the air currents. And the air currents are not only like pre-given, but are shaped by the actual movements of the bird, which then affects how the bird moves. So there's this kind of circular feedback. And that whole system is where the flight is. It's not just in the wing. And so the equivalent for that would be like, if you say like, where is experience? It would be in the whole embodied physical system of like an organism interacting with an environment.
Yeah, it reminds me of this conversation we had a while back with the philosopher of perception, Masvita Chiramuta, who I think she describes like what a color is. Like, is a color out in the world, or is it something that a sort of our mind is active in creating? And so she says like, the sweater isn't blue. We see the sweater bluely. It's kind of like, a process as opposed to a noun. When
I
you
love
bring up
that.
flight,
I read her book.
oh, you did,
And
nice.
it was great. Yeah. But it's exactly that point. It's like these things are happening in the relation between the two.
Mm. It also made me think of how there might be a plurality that we could recognize in intelligence or sentience, or, I mean, the example people like to use is flight, where there are many ways to fly. So there's a way birds fly by flapping their wings, but airplanes also fly. They don't fly in the way that birds do, but we say that they're both ways of flying. And same thing with like artificial intelligence. AIs might be intelligent in a way that humans are not intelligent. There could be many ways of being intelligent. Maybe humans and our close relatives in the mammals have our way of being sentient with brains, but maybe there's another means of being sentient that plants have. What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Evan Thompson in our interview, like plants are just a different strategy cellularity. So it's like you can have like animals are one type of multicellular creature and plants are another, and they just have very different strategies. Animals pick up and move around, but their form is sort of developmentally set. Like they're going to look pretty much the way, their genes are telling them to look. I mean, with some caveats to that, but like, a plant is going to be rooted and stuck in the ground and can't go anywhere, but it grows instead of moves, and it can grow into like fantastically different, none of that's like sort of predetermined. And so it's just a very different strategy of being a multicellular creature. And likewise, I think it could be just a very different strategy of perception, intelligence, and all of these things. I mean, it's interesting because like Calvo's lab is called the minimal intelligence lab. So it's sort of implying like, we want to look at what is the minimal unit of intelligence, or the minimal cognitive system. And in these E approaches, the answer to that would usually be like a cell, a living cell. So anything that's alive would meet the definition of cognitive in those views. But there's an interesting thing there where like even the word minimal sort of implies like some kind of hierarchy, like we're the top of intelligence and this is just minimal intelligence. But it's like, it depends how you define intelligence. Like if photosynthesis was on an IQ test, plants would do better than us. So it depends what you're trying to do. A plant is better at being a plant than we are at being a plant, and we're better at being humans than plants are at being humans. So
Can you tell us about any more interesting tidbits or anecdotes or ideas that, for whatever reason, didn't end up making it into the final draft?
Yeah, there's so much stuff. And the draft got long, but but there was so much more. Yeah, I mean, there's a few ways to look at it. Like there's certainly more to say about plants. For me, the really interesting stuff is the more to say about cognitive science, and the implications of these different views. So, like one of them would be like you just mentioned AI, and there's this question of like, is AI going to become sentient? Is AI going to become conscious? All this stuff that I think is becoming more pressing somehow with like Chat GPT and all these AI things that are suddenly seem to be taking off. And what's interesting is, again, it's like it depends how you're defining all these terms for humans. So if you really think a brain in a vat, like in the Matrix or something, that a brain in a vat could have experiences and perceptions and feelings and thoughts, then you would think, okay, an AI, like a program running in a computer, is basically a brain in a vat. And so, therefore, yes, it could be conscious and it could be aware. If you think that awareness requires embodiment and interaction with the environment and interaction with the world, as these E approaches do, then you would say no. An AI, just a program running in a computer, would never have awareness. And so there's real implications for all that stuff. It doesn't mean you couldn't have artificial intelligence, but it would have to be at the very least embodied in like a robot or something. And so there's a whole world of literature about this stuff, and so much to say about that. But I thought that was really interesting. And I'm trying to think what else didn't make the cut. Yeah, I mean, I guess just this piece is sort of challenging the traditional view, and which is so funny because I feel like most people don't even realize like it has a name. It's like the idea that the mind is in the brain. Like most people just think that is cognitive science, but like that's a particular theory in cognitive science, and it has a name, which is like computationalism or cognitivism or this representational theory of mind. And so the idea of challenging that, I just find so interesting, and there's like so much to be said about all of that and what kinds of assumptions we just make that come from this whole philosophical history that it seems so intuitive to us, but it's just a historical contingency. It's not intuitive. Like before Descartes came along, nobody was like, yeah, I don't experience the world directly. It's all in my head. Like that's a modern idea that we can challenge.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What are you working on at the moment? What do you got coming up next in terms of your writing?
What am I working on at the moment? I'm working on a number of things. I'm actually trying to write a little bit of fiction, which is a different thing for me. Yeah. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, I mean, I'm working on a number of different projects that all kind of circle around these different ideas, and then also questions in like foundations of quantum mechanics, and also where these two fields intersect, which I find is so interesting. So yeah, a number of things in the works, but nothing super solid yet.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the idea about the brain in the vat, I mean, in a sense, we are a brain in a vat, and our skull is the vat, and our brain is in it. And I don't know, there's something just the simplicity of that seems very convincing. But I mean, obviously, I get what's appealing about the four E's perspective about how there's a constant feedback loop of sensory information being going to the brain, and the brain is anticipating what signals are coming in and reacting based off of that. Yeah, I mean, if you listen to the ideas of the neuroscientist Anil Seth, and he talks about how our consciousness is just a controlled hallucination, and our, what we consider, the outside world or reality is, is something that the brain is constantly constructing. um, I would like to explore more like how all those ideas can maybe coherently relate to one another, because I seem like there's so many parts of them that I find convincing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
interesting. I mean, the 4E stuff definitely would be in direct opposition to that, I think.
Right. Yeah.
And um, the other thing I found interesting is, so, they would say, okay, we are not a brain in a vat. We're actually like embodied organisms, like acting in the world. Um, and it's funny because the idea, like the term, like embodied cognition, gets used a lot. Like it's become a little bit popular. But when you look at how it's used, it's like never or rarely how they actually mean it, how the real scientific theory of it. Because people tend to use it to say like, well, the body is influencing the mind, or like signals from the body are going into the brain and the brain is using those. And like, of course that's true, but that's like a trivial, like
Mm.
yes, like people say like, oh, like judges offer harsher sentences when they're hungry. So like if you go to trial, you want the judge that like just came back from lunch and they're going to go like easier on you. And so people say that's like an example of embodied cognition, because it's like, oh, their stomach is influencing their decision making. But what real embodied cognition is saying is something much sort of deeper than that, which is, it's not just the body's influencing the mind, it's that the mind is actually constituted by these bodily processes. So the mind is not just in the brain, it's the brain and the body interacting with the environment. That is the mind. And so if you take away the body and you just have a brain, even if you could keep it alive, that you would lose experience, you would lose consciousness, you would lose all that stuff.
Mm.
And in that sense, it's not a controlled hallucination. It's a actual engagement with the real world. And I think this is something that was left out of the article a little bit too, or it was hinted at, but this stuff has profound like ethical implications, because as long as we really do think like, I don't, I'm sort of safe in my skull and I don't interact with the world directly. And this is all hallucination and who knows what the real world is and all this stuff. Then we see ourselves as standing apart from the world. We treat the world in this very
Mm.
resource centric, mechanistic way. And that has not done us well. We're destroying the world. And if you, and again, like if this, it's not that ethics should determine our scientific theories. The science has to come first, but the idea that the world is the controlled hallucination, or that the mind is in the brain, that's not like a scientific fact. That's just a philosophical theory that we attach to a bunch of scientific facts. And so, given that the damage that it's doing, you could ask, would it be helpful to explore these other ideas? And if they're true, maybe we would stand in a new relation to the world that would be beneficial for plants and for us.
Yeah, I mean, one way you could describe that is that, for a long period of time, many different human groups kind of had a animistic philosophy and outlook on nature, and saw that, nature was just as alive as humans are. And then, when we got to the Enlightenment and kind of scientific rationality, that idea was kind of discarded, and we tended to think that if we understood things as not necessarily alive, but having some kind of mechanism underlying its behavior, then we could understand that and use it to our advantage. But yeah, as you say, that's kind of had some downstream consequences on how we treat the living world.
Yeah. And look, like if it worked, like if it was a scientific idea that like really just worked, then you would have to say, all right, well, that's how it is. But what happened is, like, when you take all that animism and take subjectivity and take, all of that stuff out of the world, this is what Descartes did, because he wanted like a mechanistic physics. And that was the whole reason behind sticking the mind in the head, was to say, okay, I want the world to be purely objective. I want to be able to describe it mathematically. For Descartes, it was just in terms of geometry, and anything that doesn't fit that scheme, including mind, perception, thoughts, experiences, whatever, color, all that stuff, the secondary qualities and things, I'm going to stick all that in the head and not worry about it, and therefore I can describe the whole world. And if that had worked, it would have been great. But the problem is, like, now here we are, all these centuries later, saying like, well, we have a hard problem of consciousness. Like, how does subjectivity come in? Where's the mind? What's thoughts? Like, and it's like, well, of course we don't know where, because it was like excluded by definition from the beginning of this whole story. And so, so now you have, all these cognitive scientists struggling with those questions. And I think that points to just like a problem with the assumptions that we're making from the start. So I think, whatever theory you subscribe to, I think it's just worth like questioning those assumptions. And I think what Calvo's doing is so interesting because it's using something you just wouldn't like think about, like plants, to question these basic assumptions.
Totally. I think that's a great note to end on. But before we go, do you want to tell our viewers how they can find you online? Do you have a website where they can check out your work, or social media accounts where they can follow you and what you're interested
Yes.
in working on?
So I have a website, amandagefter.com, and I try to keep it pretty updated. I left Twitter recently, so I'm a little bit of a social media hermit. I do have a Mastodon account, which I assume is Amanda Gefter, but I don't remember for sure. Yeah, people, if they want to contact me, they can contact me through the website, amandagefter.com.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much, Amanda. It was great talking to you. This is a fascinating topic, and I'd love to return to it.
Awesome. Thank you so much.